We passed a human milestone, first time in human history where more than 50% of the population lives in cities. So that's one of the reasons why studying cities in global perspective now has become such a major issue, from the UN to all the different development agencies and of course academics, is that most of us now live in cities, first time ever. The other is that there's been growing recognition of the important role that cities play in the global economy. Right? Cities are financial centers, they're political centers, they're military centers. So that when we talk about globalization and how globalization is shaped, a lot of that shaping takes place in cities and by cities in different ways. So that's another reason why people have begun to kind of pay attention to cities on a global scale. The third and final one is that it becomes more and more difficult with each passing year to think about a global challenge that we face, from climate change to war, political protest, democracy, water, sanitation. All of those problems, which are global in scope, have very clear urban dimensions. Many of them, you could argue, are fundamentally urban problems, even if we think about them as problems on a global scale. So there's more and more attention to addressing these issues: climate change, conflict, development, addressing these at the level of the city. And the final thing I'll say before we get into the actual work, but you hear more about this, is that for a long time when we thought about cities on a global scale, we thought about how does globalization affect cities. So cities were seen as kind of passive. There was this big global thing out there and cities were affected by it. More recently, there's been much more attention to the way that cities actually shape globalization. So if you want to understand why does globalization take the form it does, understanding the role of cities in that process of shaping globalization becomes essential.
This idea, sort of neoliberal idea about that that globalization and development should be realized in the third world. It should be done through privatization of state enterprises. There should be a turn towards markets and away from the state. But there's another form of globalization that I see another kind of consensus that's been moving through DC on and off, and this is the non-aligned movement. And this is equally global and equally economically global. And the non-aligned movement moved through DC because DC had an enormous Black Power movement, and cooperative movement in DC is very strong. And these groups had linked up themselves with the non-aligned movement. People moved from Washington DC, traveled through Africa to meet with non-aligned leaders. So it was this is another kind of global network. What I'm doing to document these two different kinds of globalization, I'm doing archival research, and I'm focusing on one particular public housing project, the Arthur Capron Public Housing Project in Ward 6 of Washington, D.C. I am doing oral histories with former residents of this public housing project. The housing project was there from the 1950s and was closed in 2005. So this housing project provides an insight into how people experienced globalization moving through the 50s, 60s, 70s until 2005.
So one of the ways in which I look at the cultural geography of the city is to think about issues of caste and class and language and how they're mapped out in different parts of the city. And I give a history of not only English, but also Hindi and Urdu, and the relationship between the colonial and the post-colonial eras. In the interest of time, I will jump to my second example. Okay, so this is an example of a different way in which I look at cultural geography, and in some ways it's a little bit more obvious, at least at first. My current project is about urban space and development, especially around Delhi's new metro system. And one of the things that has become part of my actual ethnographic practice are the photographs that I've been taking, actually, all over the city for the last 5 years now. I've been working on this project in different ways. I do a lot of interviews, I do a lot of different things. I ride the train a lot, participant observation. I talk to communities that live near metro stations. This photo, I think, encapsulates one strand of the research, which I think you could probably figure out almost on your own, and that is the way in which the metro, which is mostly on elevated lines throughout the city, and that's mostly because it's a lot cheaper. Part of it is underground, but a lot of it is overground. It of course, creates new boundaries for neighborhoods. This is a slum area, basically, in the area called Okla, which is an industrial area. But right next to the slum area is a very fancy area where there are a lot of industries and a lot of people, well, a lot of the fancy people in that area, they come in their BMWs and SUVs. The slum, people living in the informal settlement, also known as slum, they look up at the metro, and for them it's a symbol and marker of their aspiration and what they don't have, because they don't have jobs to go to, so they don't have a reason to take the metro. And most of them say, this metro line above my head, the people I talk to here, is just a reminder of what I don't have.
What do you think, how many of us globally would be living in slums? Like out of 6 billion, what do you think is the number? Any guesses? Yes?
A billion. A billion.
That's absolutely correct. So that's one. No, you're wrong. 1,000,000,001. I just came out of slums, but yeah. So no, this is that's absolutely a right number in 2001, but we are growing, and by 2030, the estimate is 2 billion of those people will be living in slums. So it's a large problem, and it's clearly a city's problem. And so as Tony said, that people are moving to cities, and as it happened in North America or Europe, it's not happening in the global south. The people are facing housing challenges and all different sorts of problems. They're not moving on the socioeconomic ladder. And this is not just one generation's issue. Like several slums has people living in those slums for about 3 generations now. For example, largest slum in Mumbai in India has people living there for 3 generations and not coming out of that place. So it's kind of, and that's a big concern. I mean, I came here, and by some definitions, I also lived in a slum, and many of the grad students coming from international places would do that. But then you rise the ladder, and that's what happens in more equitable societies or more democratic societies. But in a lot of developing countries, that's not happening.
Community associations embody a tension between this utopian vision of a space where everyone can get along and share in the governance of their community, and then its expression in the private realm as an organization focused on the legal enforcement of a particular neighborhood look or aesthetic. So for the past 30 years, the development of community associations and other CIDs has grown dramatically. From 1980 to 2000, half of all the new housing units constructed in the US were part of a community association. They have also expanded globally, so there have been studies on private neighborhoods in Latin America, South Africa, Lebanon, China, Russia, Spain, Portugal, New Zealand, and Switzerland. Common interest developments often have been critiqued for their exclusivity. So what Cashin has called a secession of the successful. In the US, CIDs began as enclaves for the wealthy and have gradually expanded to middle-class housing developments. Rarely do these developments encourage the development of rental housing or permit the residents of rental units to participate in the governance of their community. So this project that I'm presenting today examines an exception to this trend. So it focuses on Reston Association, which includes 18-member apartment complexes. So it's a community association that includes rental housing and includes it at all income levels from Section 8 up to market rate units. Reston Association also allows renters to be members of the association. It considers them Class C members, which means they can take full advantage of all its recreation programs and amenities. They can serve on advisory committees, they can run for the board of directors, and can also vote in board of directors elections. This project examines the experience of apartment residents as a subset of all the renters living in Reston Association. I hope to better understand what opportunities existed for these residents to participate in their community, both social and recreational and civic. And then I wanted to know how they are currently involved in their communities, what challenges they might face to greater participation, and how some of the challenges that they face might be addressed.
Looking at climate change, I wanted to know where the action was. It certainly wasn't in the federal government. It certainly wasn't in the international arena. It actually was in cities. So that's where I started. Looking into the impacts of the cities and what they were beginning to do to adapt to climate change, it became pretty apparent quickly that you had to look beyond the city limits to see where the action needed to go next. So I started to look at this regional area that can be labeled a social ecological system, which basically just means you've got your social system and you've got your ecological system, the nature that you live within, and you can't separate these two. They're intricately tied together. And the regions that I'm choosing to look at, it's especially clear.
There's kind of a brain model lineage, you could call it, where brain drain, brain gain, and brain circulation. With brain drain, you know, you have this exodus of highly skilled workers in the developing world coming to the developed world to seek jobs and so on and so forth. Brain gain is the idea that individuals in the developing world are actually trying to accumulate human capital so they can seem really, you know, desirable to these corporations in the developed world, and they're kind of boosting up the level of well-being in their country by doing that. And that's driving the development process. And then there's this idea of brain circulation, where there's actually a circular movement of intellectuals between really global cities, if you want to talk about the global city level. And they're kind of precipitating transnational economic arrangements between, say, Bangalore and San Francisco with computer engineers, and so on and so forth. But you know, when we're looking at this, it kind of claims on its face that everybody gains from this circular movement. And we really disagree. I think there's certain exploitation that's obscured, and also the idea that this is only a movement of the highly skilled, and there's no precipitating you know, semi-skilled or low-skilled workers who actually provide the foundation for that economic development to happen.
What I criticize about the brain circulation model is a focus on economic impacts rather than, it overlooks cultural barriers for people, particularly linguistic. There's also barriers for citizenship, things like that, for full participation in these, you know, newfound cities and context in which they're moving, but also overlooks the cultural impacts of the migrants themselves, what they bring, you know, to these new places that they begin to dwell in. And we can think about DC as, I think, a prime example of the cultural impact of people who have brought, you know, a spice of life or whatever to, you know, mid-Atlantic coastal city, I don't know. Yeah. And finally, we also want to, as Josh mentioned, that the paradigm focuses too narrowly on like highly skilled workers rather than it glosses over the total migration, I guess, because, I mean, for one, there's a lot of invisible people that are moving around between these places that are sort of facilitating this production model, global production model, and we can think of them as like cleaning people, you know, food producers, hospitality, things like that. You can't have a global city without those things. You can't have these sorts of highly skilled production sectors without these things. And I think, you know, we're just scratching the surface here, but that's kind of the way we're coming at the critique of the brain circulation model particularly.